G'day guys, welcome to episode 5 of our mega surf kayak build. Today I'm going to be concentrating on building the coaming, which is the large apron that runs around the cockpit of the surf kayak, and also the two thigh braces that actually allow the paddler to really engage into the boat to get superior control and fit and comfort inside this boat. So by the end of this episode, we're going to basically have these things fabricated and demolded. So there's a lot of detail in this one with regard to the laminate schedules and why I use the laminate schedules that I'm using on this particular product. Right now, I'm working on two large Bimini hardtop sections for a Seawind 1160 catamaran. Now this is a 12 or 11.6 metre catamaran, cruising catamaran, and currently it had a canvas infill on either side of its Targa hardtop, and basically for a safety and for aesthetics and for function, we've made these out of 30mm foam core. Quite an interesting process. I've filmed the entire process, including the prelude and right up until the fitting of it. So that's going to be a totally separate series here on the Composite shop. Hope you enjoy it. Let's get into it. Okay, so essentially there's 4 components to each of these surf kayaks that I make. There's obviously the hull, the deck, the coaming rim, which actually enables the spray skirt to seal around the cockpit of the kayak, and there's also some thigh braces, which are small composite parts that you lock your legs into so that you sort of remain at one with the boat. Now, it's very important to have thigh braces in these boats so that you can raise your knee, raise your hip, and actually feel the movement of the boat, particularly because it's a surf kayak. It has very hard rails, which are the seams of the boat, which are quite sharp, which enable the boat to dig into the wave and obviously maintain control on the wave. So those components are all made with molds. Now, I've set up jigs for pretty much everything I do, and the reason why I do that is to simplify the process and make life a lot easier for myself in the long run. And you'll notice here I've got a couple of bits of 2x4s or 4x2s, as we call them here in Australia, bonded to the actual mold itself, and this sits on a Lazy Susan, and these Lazy Susans are a great thing because it means I can spin the mold as I'm working on it. If you just had the mold sitting here on the surface of my table here, then the problem with that's going to be that you got to pick it up and move it, and you might disturb the laminate that you're working on. This simply is all of my coaming rims, which are these are the coaming molds, are all set up like this with that similar spacing there, so that I can simply overlay it over the jig that I work on here, and now I'm able to rotate my product as I'm making it. I find little things like that make a massive difference in the end result and reduces a lot of flaws that you might find otherwise when you're working on things that don't have jigs set up. So well worth spending a little bit of time making a jig. Another interesting thing to note is that all of my molds, although this looks all messy and untidy, I always make a mold protector where possible, which is an old product. Maybe this was a second, maybe it had a flaw in it that I've done years ago. I leave it on my surface of my molds, particularly the ones I'm using regularly, so that I'm protecting the mold when I've got it in storage. I also store these in a bag upstairs and out of the way so they're not going to get trampled on, so that my molds always stay in as good a condition as possible. So I just simply remove that part, and I've already got a reasonably clean surface to work with. So the first process of this will be to give it a good clean with that denatured alcohol or methylated spirits, as we call it here, and then basically I don't need to buff this again because it's already a pretty sound, good surface for producing a product out of. Now, I mentioned the thigh braces for this particular kayak, and these are the molds. They're very simple molds. They're around about 8 layers thick. Now, a good general rule, I like to have my molds made. When I make the molds, I generally make them about 4 times thicker than the product I want to pull out of it. If it's something I'm going to use on a regular basis, I try to make them nice and rigid and solid so that when I'm levering and demolding the product, I don't end up with any flexing of the mold, and as a result we end up with a perfect surface. So this is a second that I produced, just a piece of carbon Kevlar. I laid it in the mold there, and you know, it's probably thick enough to be used as a product itself, but I had a bit of extra resin one day and I thought rather than leave the molds subject to damage, make a cover. I've got a perfect surface here because it's protected by the product that came out of it. So ultimately, that's a really good policy. If you've got something like a car fairing or a blower for a bonnet of a car, and you sort of got a bit of extra resin and a bit of extra laminates, make a quick mold protector. That'll protect your mold and keep it dust free and ready to use the minute you pull it off. So these here, I've got my two very simple molds, and I'm going to lay these up now, and the layup schedule for this is quite simple. They don't need to be ultra light. They're a very robust component of the boat, and it's going to be copying a lot of flex and a lot of torsion as you're driving your knee up into it. So these are going to be the next thing I'm going to make. So today I'm going to prepare and gel coat both of these products, and this afternoon I'm going to come back and laminate them. So in the fabricating of composite parts, it's vital that you aim for a good surface finish with a gel coat. The reason why is that that's really all anybody's going to see. How you laminate the structure and formulate that schedule for the laminating underneath is a whole other story alone on its own. So the important thing is you start with a good surface. So make sure your mold's in good condition, and cleaning it with the denatured alcohol, with that methylated spirits, I don't think I've ever mentioned why I use this stuff. You don't ever use acetone or any type of thinners on a gel coat surface. And the reason why is that will dissolve it. This stuff flashes off very quickly, this denatured alcohol, but it also doesn't damage the surface. I've been using it for years and I've never damaged the surface. However, I've had splashed acetone on the mold, and that is not a good scene. So good clean with that. Once again, where, just as I've mentioned, throughout my whole yacht build, if you don't wipe off the residue of this denatured alcohol, you're going to end up with a film of it in between that and your wax. So cleaning is probably the most important part of the preparation. Giving it a good once over, and make sure you've got good lighting too. I've got a couple of big LEDs that are shining down on here at the moment that are giving me really good lighting, so I can see the surface of my mold without having to go and adjust lights and run a torch over it. And I then like to give it a good scan before I do anything else. I'm not sponsored by anyone. I provide my own materials. I pay for everything myself, but I only ever go to the big guys. Allnex in Australia are sort of the leading brand, provide good colour charts and the like. But you know, at the end of the day, by buying it regularly, you're getting the freshest batch, and in fact I record the batch numbers often just so I've got a record of when and if there is ever a problem, I can go back to that and say this is the batch that I wasn't happy with. And it has happened a couple of times where I've had a bit of a bad batch, and not so much from this manufacturer but from other manufacturers, and that's not a great scene when you're trying to produce something that's commercially available. Catalysts, buy again from a reputable manufacturer. And with regard to using catalyst, you should never handle even the container without a glove on. To get this stuff is incredibly corrosive, and I never ever touch this stuff without a gloved hand, and I never ever touch it without some sort of eye protection. With regard to using catalyst, there's generally a few different types you can use. You can get a slow release and a normal release. Normal release I generally use around the winter months into spring and possibly the beginning of autumn or your fall. And then the slow release I use in the summer months. It gives me a little bit more working time. So there's ways of playing with your catalysts and upping and lowering the percentage and mixing it too. I generally work at around 1.5% with gel coat. Just gives me that little bit of extra time to get my material down. Now on a product like I'm building here, I'm going to use a brush gel And the reason why is that to set up a spray gun and everything to do a small part like that, you know, you're really not going to get a good result. Plus you're going to have the stuff absolutely everywhere. It's almost impossible to contain the mess with a spray gun. With a brush, I'm going to end up with globules of gel coat falling off my mold here. That's okay, I can chip them off and my surface will stay relatively clean. So brush gel coat is generally the way to go for smaller components, unless you're doing 100 of them or 10 of them at a time. That's a different story. But because I make everything component sort of, you know, bespoke, I guess, or to each individual custom order, it's very hard to set up a spray gun to do this. You'll find also with the finishes that I do on my surf kayaks and with my smaller boats, I tend to only use brush gel anyway. It's a way of me containing firstly the cleanup and the mess, but secondly I make sure I get enough material down and make sure that I get a reasonably good surface. And given the intended use of the product, slightly thicker gel coat is probably a better option for this product anyway. Something to consider is your consumables as well. I generally start each new job, so to speak, particularly if it's a brand new boat, with a brand new brush. It just helps me think that I'm really starting off with a clean slate. Now these brushes I buy in packs of about 12 at a time, so they're reasonably inexpensive, and I can get years out of a good brush if I treat it properly. And the reason how I treat that properly is immediately after finishing gel coating or resin application with it, I'll get rid of the excess on some cardboard, and then I'll rinse it straight out in acetone, and I'll leave it in the acetone for an hour or so to make sure that it gets right out of up here in the stock of the brush. And then ultimately I'm ready to go again by simply giving it a quick dip, drying it off, and get ready to go again. So, but I'll never mix a black brush that I've used with black gel coat with a white. That's asking for disaster, because as soon as you put it into a black, you're going to get white streaks and ultimately grey. So we don't want that. So started with a fresh brush, and we're ready to go. Now, mixing gel coat. It's typically measured in volume how you catalyze. You got to remember this resin has had a filler put in it. So I'm really going to be catalyzing around about 280 mils of gel coat here, and we're at 1.5%. And you can see my little scale here on my capillary dispenser. And I'm going to mask up. I'm going to basically start my catalyst process, and then I'm going to gel up my molds here so that this afternoon I can come back and laminate. Now it's very important to make sure you stir in that catalyst slowly to make sure that you don't lose a little bit of it over the side, because that's going to affect the ultimately the catalyzing. Now my working time here is going to be around 9 to 12 minutes based on the catalyzing I've given there. Now that's plenty of time for me to brush on this gel coat. You certainly don't want to be over stirring either, because you're going to excite the gel coat and the catalyst and actually create heat and ultimately set it off early. That's not a good scene either. Okay, so I gelled this up about 3 hours ago. I've got an ambient temperature in here around 24 degrees Celsius. I've just come in, and a really good way to check if your laminate or your gel coat is ready to be laminated on is just to run your finger along it, and if you don't pick up any debris, then you're good to go. You don't want to lose that tack, so you wouldn't leave this overnight unless you had, you want to be sort of operating on it within 8 hours of laying it up, because you want to keep that tack, because that's going to give you that first initial chemical bond to the substrate. Now, dispensing of resins, I use polyester resin for a lot of these smaller component parts. Firstly, it's cheap. Secondly, polyesters these days are nothing like they used to be. They're quite an advanced resin. They don't hold a lot of structural value, however, like epoxies or vinyl esters do. And they're also not great for total immersion. So if something was going to sit in the water for extended periods of time, you'd be better off definitely using epoxy or even vinyl ester, which has that ability not to absorb water. It's essentially not going to get osmosis, so to speak. You see that in a lot of old polyester laminated yachts. So the way I dispense it, I have a 20-litre drum here with my polyester in it. I've given it a good stir, and I use a disposable cup here. We try to minimise our waste here in my shop, but I use a disposable cup. I'll scoop it out, tip it into a new cup, and then sit it in a deep dish bowl like this. And the reason why is no matter how much I try to get off the cup, it's going to pool in the bottom here. So I used to use a ladle like this thing here, but I found that actually harder. I think these disposable cups, they're cheap enough. And I'm going to fill up here, sit it in here, and then I'll tip it into my cup that I'm going to use. And that's it, and pretty much then I'm ready to catalyse and get going. Now, coaming like this needs to be pretty robust. It's designed to hold a neoprene spray deck with a shock cord on it, which has quite a bit of elasticity, and there's ways of reinforcing it later on, but I like to make them nice and thick to start with. You don't want to add a lot of weight unnecessarily, but I tend to use a laminating schedule of 2 layers of 300 CSM, so that's chopped strand matting, 2 layers of 300, and then a layer of 265 woven rovings, which I'll show you as I put them on, and then another layer of a 100 woven roving. Now what that does, it gives me multiple substrates all laminated down once, and essentially that gives me an incredibly strong coaming that then, once it's reinforced into the actual rim of the boat, gives it a really strong hold and a good thick texture and a good solid feel. You don't want these things flexing at all in any way, shape or form. So I'm going to basically lay up with a 300 CSM to start with, all the way around the outside rim of this, or the perimeter of this coaming. And the other thing that using 300 CSM as opposed to 600 or 450 gram is that there's less chance that you're going to get that fibrous print through into the gel coat. Now the other thing too, I've used brush gel coat. So brush gel coat tends to be applied a little bit thicker than a spray gel coat would, and you're also not going to get that sort of fibrous look you get in really thin gel coated products such as bathtubs and the like. 300 CSM, slightly lighter than a 450 obviously, and you're not going to have as much chance of having that fibre coming through into the gel coat. And you see, alright, so I've got my polyester resin, I'm going to catalyse it once again at 1.5%, use a brush to do all my brush work, and then I'm going to consolidate it down, put another layer on, another layer and another layer, and then I'm done. Right, as it's time to lay up these thigh braces, their gel coat's gone off. It's going to have 3 layers of 450 CSM and 1 layer of 265 roving on it. And it's a bit of brush work on this one. And what the idea is, you lay the 450 CSM on, wet it out with resin, let it dissolve, and then it'll sink into that cavity there. There's no real extra work needed. But it's going to be pretty simple layout, this one. about an hour and a half, I've been able to laminate both of these thigh braces, and I've peel plied these. These things I can actually leave, because what I generally do, I generally trim the edges with a bandsaw, and then I'll finish sanding them. Nothing looks fantastic until you sort of put the whole end product together, and that's the thing with composites. A lot of it is very rough and ready until the final assembly. And with the coaming, however, I generally try to green trim it. Now I do that with a Stanley blade. It can be pretty violent and pretty brutal, but if you don't trim that with the Stanley, then you're going to come in and have to use a grinder or a multi-tool. Now that can have some consequences when you've got a nice gel coat finish underneath. Firstly, grinding it, you're going to end up with possibly chipping of the gel coat around where the mould edges is, so I don't want to do that. If I can green trim it fairly smoothly along the edge of the mould, then I'm able then to be able to give it a very light sand, and the finishing is quite simple. Here's our coaming that we laid up earlier, and I'm just going to show you what I mean by green. This edge here is still pretty flexible. Now it is actually quite hard in the surface there, but it's very, very tacky, so it still wouldn't be what I'd consider to be sort of, you know, trimmable, because if I start forcing this with a blade to cut off this excess edge, there's a very high likelihood I'm going to delaminate it from the gel coat. So I reckon I've probably got another half an hour to wait on that. You know, patience is a virtue here, and often on a hot day it'll be done before I've even finished making those coamings. This will already be set up and ready to go. Sometimes in winter I've waited hours at night, had a hole like this going late at night, you know, 10, 11 o'clock at night, and then I had to wait till 3 in the morning to green trim it. Still worth it. Usually put on the telly, get the guitar out, have a bit of a bash while I'm waiting. Okay, so that green trimming is absolutely essential. By trimming it like that with a Stanley knife, you can see there I've still got a bit of a rough surface. There's no point in me sanding this at the moment because it's still green. All I'm going to do is fill up my sandpaper, waste my time. Now that I've green trimmed it back and there's no real excess hanging off the mould there, when I come back in tomorrow, and generally I don't ever demold anything on the same day. I always leave it a day or two, because if you want a really rigid product and easier to demold, very, very important to leave it at least a day. Now these thigh braces here, I'm going to leave them like that tomorrow. I'm going to come in, rip the peel ply off, demold it, and then I'll run it through a bandsaw. And then I'll be able to just sand the edges, give it a polish, done, ready to go. So I have a couple of rules when it comes to demolding any product that I fabricate, and the first of which is I always use a pair of gloves. Back in the day when I was young and a little bit keener, I used to come in and I'd get a tongue depressor or a small plastic spatula and a wedge and stick it in there and go whack. And yeah, cuts like that guy, pretty common in this game. We've all cut ourselves so badly, I've almost lost my finger on the edge of a mould. So whack some gloves on, guys. That's the first thing you need to do. The second thing you need to do is always use something made of wood or very soft plastic. I find for larger products, something like one of these is ideal. It already has a pointed sort of wedge, and it's thin enough that you can often get it in between the separating line between the mould and the gel coat, and you're not going to damage the surface of your product. Or nothing so much that you can't polish it out. With a plastic stirrer like so, or a wooden popsicle stick or tongue depressors we call them, or I call them here, which sort of look a bit like one of these sorts of things. So I use those as my initial break between the mould and the product, and then I work my way around with my gloves on. So that's so important. That's the first thing you must remember, is protect your hands, because we're talking about glass here. This is a physical glass and it will slice your finger off. Now in the heyday when I was making a lot of kayaks, and that wasn't that long ago, where we used to make a lot of boats. I still make the odd kayak, but not as many as I used to, because I'm doing a lot of other things. But you'll notice here, with this particular product here, I can simply find the position between the mold and the product. And once I've found that line, and you can see it there now that I've found it with this very, very gentle spatula, you can see it actually leaving it open, a bit like shucking an oyster. I can then slide a wooden tongue depressor in to where that guy belongs, and this isn't that difficult to demold, this one. So, and then what you do is slide it along, but we can work our way around. And it's very satisfying demolding these little thigh braces, because it's a small part. It takes about 10 minutes to make. And you can see why I'm wearing gloves. And now that is demolded, and essentially we've got a perfect product. Save a little tiny mark that will buff out. So once I can now remove the peel ply, and you'll see the difference, or the distance between the outer flange that I've left overhanging and the gel coat. I now take that to the bandsaw, trim it, and give it a wet sand and a buff, and I've got a perfect product. And once again, we demold our product with no damage. Bit of cleanup. Now the molds themselves, very important. Put your protectors straight back on. They're ready to go for next time. And that's all part and parcel. This is, I'm thinking long term, these things, I can sell to guys that have these. They might break, lose, or damage these in the field. They'll ring me up. Every time I can produce something like that, $100. Bit of work, hours work, got $100, and I can post it to them within the next day of making them. So that's something I can continue to produce until the end of time, while my product is out there and existing. So, and now that we've successfully demolded the thigh braces, I'm going to take you on to this coaming here. And you know, it's a pretty flimsy item until it's incorporated into the deck of the boat. But once again, we need to find a separating line that is going to allow us to remove this from its mold. Now, generally, if you look closely, I don't know whether you can see it in the light here, but right here we can see a black line and the white of the mold. I might need to bring you into the light here a little bit. So you can actually see a line there. It often is, if you can, is to give a little bit of a flex. And I'm able to find that position. Now that position there, I've slid that spatula, that paint scraper in there, only about 1 millimeter, because I don't want to get a scratch on it, and I have dulled the surface of that. And once again, the tongue depressor, or the popsicle stick, put it actually in to where that goes, and we just do exactly the same thing as I did with those thigh braces. And this principle applies to just about every type of demolding. Often with larger products, we're going to be using big wedges, hammers, mallets, and to work air, water, anything you can do to remove a product without damaging it. And once I've got that in there, I can start to work my way around the product. You can see I found my way around it, nice and loose, and it's cracking off. So that's now demolded. Bugger all force that I need to physically get this off its mould. Alright, so that's now released. And you're going to see, and you think, my God, that looks as rough as guts. And that, my friends, will clean up to be a perfect coaming. Again, it's all in the preparation and all in that cleanup and final end finishing, which is the key to the composite shop. This is why I've started this channel, is to show you guys how you can finish something that has a rough edge like that. Get that guy into a finished saleable product. Good stuff. So if you like this episode, guys, don't forget to give it a like and please subscribe, because ultimately what's going to happen is we're going to be piecing together all of these parts into you know, a pretty nice product, and everything that we do here on the Composite Shop is all about you know, that finishing and that quality of finish that you expect when you walk into a showroom and you see a boat, a bathroom, a shower unit, a spa, a swimming pool. All of those things need to be completed to perfection, and as you can see, don't often start that way, do they? That's the important part of composites, is how you finish them. So let's get on with it, eh? And I'll see you next time on the Composite Shop.